Hi there, my friend. I'm Peter Barron. Welcome to today's episode of the Independent School Moonshot podcast. I am thrilled to welcome my friend Josh Clark to the pod. Josh is the Director of Enrollment Management at TASIS England. Josh and I have known each other for a long, long time, probably dating back almost 20 years at this point. And honestly, when people ask me about international recruitment, he is one of the names I always probably too many times because I know Josh has talked to a lot, a lot of heads of school because I've given his name to them for just to have conversations about the state of the international market. And that's what we're here today to talk about more broadly is like what is going on internationally. If you're an independent school that's recruiting overseas, what are the things that you should be thinking about? I can't think of a better person to have this conversation with. So with that, Josh Clark, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much. It's great to always have conversations with you. I always walk away learning more and feeling like I'm in a better position to do better things in the future. So happy to be here.
I'm so glad you're here. And, we're going to get into all of this, right? There's a lot for us to cover. We've got a lot of ground that we want to traverse over the next half hour, 40 minutes. But before we do, can you introduce yourself, your role at TASIS, and then just talk about your experience recruiting internationally?
Sure. So I've been doing this for about 26 years. I started and I did 20 years of boarding schools in the United States, and I did 14 years. My last stint was at Hawaii Preparatory Academy, and I got a call one day. They said, "Hey, would you be willing to consider working at an international school?" And because I've been doing all this international travel for 20 years, I said, "Sure, we'd look at it." And we flew over to the UK and toured and interviewed at TASIS England, fell in love with the school, and decided to have that be our next adventure. And so it's been 6 years now at TASIS England. I'm the Director of Enrollment and Marketing. Um, I decided not to go with the enrollment management title because that's an internal word. A lot of us in the education world know what enrollment management means, but not out in the prospective families don't know what enrollment management means. So I thought it would at least be a little bit more digestible to say enrollment and marketing for them. But I'm over admissions, our summer program, marketing and communications, and alumni and development. And what we really are doing, and I was kind of doing that a little bit in Hawaii just at the very beginning stages, is we're really trying to look at how can we connect with everyone who's connected to the school that's not in the school, either as a current parent or a current student. So it's alumni, prospective families, to make sure that we're providing a consistent and coherent image and brand and messaging for those families. But I've always been in admissions ever since I started in the year 2000. And even at the very beginning, I started doing international recruitment and admissions when I was at a school that no longer exists. They closed a couple of years ago. But, doing everything from those 8-week trips, going to 15 different countries, all the way through to just zipping back and forth to certain countries. But over the years, I've learned that there's a method to the madness, and if you really want to find enrollments, you've got to do more than just get on a plane. There's a lot to do with it, and there's a lot of strategy and planning around it. So I'm sure that's what we're going to be talking about today.
Absolutely. And look, I love to set the stage because I have conversations with schools right now and clearly, recruiting internationally has changed quite a bit in the last few years. And, even if you just look back, say 5 years ago, there's been a pretty significant shift. So like what's happening out there? What should be people be paying attention to?
Well, I think there's several things that people should be aware of. First, you've heard of the word VUCA before: volatile, uncertain, chaotic, and ambiguous. Is that the kind of the terms that people talk about?
Yeah.
I think we've always, at least since I've been doing this for 25 years, we've always had challenges, whether it's geopolitics or currency fluctuations or immigration issues, demographic issues. But what I found now is that they're happening more frequently and they're happening on top of each other so that there isn't any sort of a rest period. And you don't really know what are the contributing factors to the challenges that you're facing because you're dealing with multiple challenges that are volatile and uncertain and create this ambiguity. And so I think for me, the rate of change and the uncertainty around that change has really ramped up quite a bit over the years, and it's harder now to identify what the problem is, or at least what is causing the problem. You kind of know what the problem is, but you don't know what's causing it, so it's harder to then address the solution. So that's number one, is this the rate of volatility, or the frequency and the number of things that are happening, contributing factors that are happening at the same time. I think number two, one of the issues that we're dealing with in the market is there's a changing mentality, or I guess persona, that are of our families, our international families, who are looking at study abroad. If you think about what we were dealing with 30 years ago, 20 years ago, and 10 years ago, you're really looking at a smattering of international students from a handful of countries, and then there's usually one huge population from one area. So in the 80s or 90s, it was Japan, then it was Korea, and then it became China, so on and so forth. And I think what we're looking at nowadays in the past 5 years is that there is not going to be a new huge market that's out there. And so, one, we have to then be a little bit more careful about what markets there are and how we invest in those markets. But two, we have to look at who are these new people that are coming in, because it's no longer I want to go to a US boarding school because I want to go to a US university because I want to, there's a path that they have in place, or I want to go to the UK and go to university there. There's a lot of times where we could kind of write down a quick and easy persona or profile of these international families coming from specific regions in the world. But now they've become much more complex. They're looking for more than just one thing from their experience. It's not just the academics. It's not just the college matriculation. They're expecting more. They want more, and they're willing to look beyond just one location. So it's not just I'm only looking at the US or I'm only looking at the UK. They're going to look at the US, UK, Canada. They're looking everywhere, Europe, so on and so forth. And so that change in their profile, we have to be aware of. And then the third thing that we have to be aware of as schools is that more schools are beginning to realize the need for international enrollments to maintain their financial sustainability. And so there's more fish, I guess, lures in the sea. There's more people fishing. And so the competition is there. It's not just how to compete against the school or the boarding school within your state or within your county or anything like that. Now you're looking at boarding schools coming out of a lot of different countries, but even regional boarding schools that are nearby. So if you're pulling students from Southeast Asia, you're now competing with boarding schools that are in Southeast Asia, and they're providing similar curriculum, they're providing similar college matriculation, and they're a third of the price. Now, some families still are going to look at US or UK, but other families are going to question, do I need to do that, pay that much money and have my child that far away to still get the outcome that we're looking for? And what you're going to see is it's almost like death by 1,000 paper cuts, is that there's so much more competition that everything is drawing away one or two students that would have normally 10 years ago come to you or come to your US boarding schools or UK boarding schools, but they're just being siphoned away one or two at a time. And all of a sudden you no longer have this flexibility to really be comfortable with your margins, because they're all super flat and sometimes even negative, and you've got to work a lot harder to get what you were yielding just a few years ago.
It's interesting too. Like, I'm glad you brought up Southeast Asia, right? We're seeing schools pop up there for sure to, recruit basically in region. But if you look at just the growth of international schools as a sector since 2000, I mean, back in 2000, there were 2,000. Fast forward today, by some accounts, it's 15, by 1,000, by other accounts, it's 20,000. I mean, it's a significant growth. I mean, explosion. And there are a lot of reasons for that. But what's interesting about it is now families have opportunities to get a UK diploma, an American diploma, a Canadian diploma, an Australian diploma right in their own cities, which really calls into question, hey, if we can graduate with this, have the outcomes that we're looking for, and then go to a US or UK or wherever, for higher ed, it just changes the equation. So I guess if you're a school who's historically have had a lot of success in Asia, and maybe now you're feeling like, it's just getting harder. Like, what does this all mean? I mean, how are you thinking about these shifts in dynamics?
Yeah. And I think part of it is we were resting on our laurels, and we have to recognize that 10, 15, 20 years ago, families didn't have a lot of options. So it was really, I go to the local, international school or the American school or whatever it is, the British school in our city. But the only other option beyond that is I have to go boarding, and I have to go to the US or the UK. But now, if you think about almost every country between you and the US or you and the UK, there are countries that have boarding schools between you and them. All of a sudden, the competitive challenge that you were facing domestically. I remember I worked for a boarding school in New England, and I remember every time a family flew into Boston Logan Airport, they had to drive by 32 other boarding schools before they got to mine. And so I had to start to think about, how do I make it worthwhile for them to come to me when they could, that much closer to an airport, that much closer to, to Boston, so on and so forth. How do I make sure that they're willing to come out and then choose me? Now you just take that from a domestic angle and you apply that to the international angle. There are people that they could fly much shorter, they can stay in their own country, and their options not only within their city, but within their country, within their region, and within the continent, they have options available to them. So what we need to do is we need to say, first, we can't just assume that people are going to come to us because we're great. And I think a lot of people thought that 20 years ago, build it and they will come was the mentality. And we're an American education, we're a British education, we have these great schools and people are going to come. But they only came because they had no other options. And now that they have this wealth of choice in front of them, some families are still going to choose us because they recognize that there are either limitations or differences between what an American education is in some of those schools in their country, or what a British education looks like. Either they're not able to get, the teachers may not be from the US or from the UK, or the curriculum might be a little bit different. Whatever happens to be there, they might
Maybe
recognize
change in services, whatever it may be.
services, so on and so
Yeah.
forth. They might do that. But there are also other families who are going to look at the value proposition and say, for the money, I'm willing to accept that it's not going to be at the same level because I can still get to where I want to go. And this takes me back to an analogy I've always had in the back of my mind. When my wife and I were looking at buying a car, we first thought we were going to get this car at a certain price and a certain level, and we were really looking at it. But then as we started to look at other vehicles, we finally thought, why are we spending that much money? We can get, and we went with a Hyundai, and it was $20,000 less. It had a great warranty. Does it do all the things that we originally were wanting the other car to do? No. But were we okay? Because it's still going to get us from point A to point B. It did. And so we were willing to make that decision based upon cost and the sacrifice of some of the outcomes that we were originally looking for, because the other outcomes that we wanted still held that value. And so when we're looking at this, there are going to be the Hyundais of the international school world that are out there that may not be the same as the Mercedes or the BMWs or whatever you're thinking of. And there are families that are still going to want that. They absolutely, but there are fewer of those families. And because there's so many cars out there, there's so much more choice that all of a sudden you are one of many, many. And it's going to be harder to raise your voice to make it heard in that crowded marketplace.
So what are some things people can do? I mean, whenever you have constraints, there's always opportunities inside of those constraints. So when you're looking at this kind of shift in the way things are, what do you point to? Like, what do you see that could be like, here's some interesting things that we could do?
Yeah. Well, I think first of all, a lot of times I think people think of international recruitment as a monolith. Everyone's the same. And what we need to realize is that families in China are different than families from India, who are different from families from Saudi Arabia, different from Nigeria, so on and so forth. And even when you then build your personas around your different regions, what you then have to realize is that persona is a kind of a stereotype. And so it is going to capture a lot of things that people are going to be, kind of manifest when you're talking with them from that area, but it's not going to be 100%. And every individual and every family, their priorities, their aspirations, their concerns are going to be different. It's going to be approximation, but it's not going to be the same. So for me, when we're looking at our international recruitment, what I try to do is see how much we can move from the generalities to the specifics as much as possible. And then when we're building out our persona and we start to develop our messaging and things like that, then what I need to do is make sure that we don't back ourselves into a corner and we're so strict in how we interact with families that we can't be flexible in how we communicate with them based upon who they are and what they want.
Right.
And so what that means then is that a lot of your messaging is a little bit more of a like arrows in your quiver. You need to pull out what you need for the moment and not just have something ready to go and say, here's what it is. Here's the story that I want to tell you and you better listen, because they don't necessarily want to listen to that. And so I think that flexibility in talking about your school doesn't mean that you have to be inauthentic. You should always be talking about the school as the school is, but you can present the school in very different ways according to what that person's priorities are, and still be authentic to the school itself. And a lot of times I find that messaging can sometimes be a little bit too ossified or a little bit too strict, in that a lot of times you send that young travel, you get the road warrior, you hire the young person to get out there on the road, and they've been trained to talk about the school, but they may not have the experience or the understanding to nuance things, or the experience of the school to be able to talk about it in different ways, so that it can resonate with people in different ways. So that's the first thing, I think, is that idea of being flexible in how you talk about the school and how you can interact and build relationships with people based upon not only their region, but also their individuality. The other thing that I think that we've run into is we've got to be a little bit more flexible in our thinking. A lot of times we talk about schools being, 20th century institutions, kind of built on the factory model, and we need to do more 21st century skills. But a lot of times that's been applied to the school itself, and we're still doing 20th century admissions work and not looking at it from a 21st century. The only time I've seen a disruptor in the world of enrollment management is with AI, and how schools are starting to talk about how to deal with AI, how to integrate it into their practices and all of those things. But that's one of many things that we should be looking at. And if you only limit yourself to the role of AI in enrollment management, if you've limited yourself to just that, then you've limited yourself, because there's so many other things that you should be thinking about and considering. And so if you look at like the Stanford design thinking concept, where you go through this idea of empathize, you then define what the problem is after you've kind of assessed what it is, and then you start to ideate what the potential solutions are, you prototype, and then you test. What we need to do is go through that same process. And that's why I think, Moonshot and a lot of these other, especially what you're doing, is you're trying to go through this process of saying things are not the same as that they used to be. And the business model of independent education is not going to be sustainable unless we look at it in a different way. And I think we need to do the same thing with international recruitment as well, to say, how can we go out there and do it? And that's where we start talking about the strategy of international recruitment. There's so much prep work and planning that needs to be put in place. There's a lot of things you can be doing once you're in the country or in that city, but then the follow-up needs to happen as well. And what I think is interesting is what I would have done 5 or 10 years ago is changing to what I'm doing now, because what we have to go through now is a little bit more of this. Everything is becoming personalized. And so I can no longer just say, here's what I'm going to do when I go to this country. I'm going to set this up and it's just going to be kind of a rinse repeat. Now it's going to be much more of, which school am I going to visit? Which agent am I going to talk to? Which families am I going to be meeting? And you start to really build things around these individuals, and then you have to plan according to that. And sometimes I have to be flexible. And so I will travel with just 1 or 2 schools or 3 schools. Sometimes I'm going to go with a group of schools, because you need that added weight of having multiple schools there to attract people in. And sometimes I'm going by myself, and that flexibility and how I travel, who I travel with, and what I do, all it has to be reactive to the situation. I'm sure we could talk more about that, but at least that's a little bit of a start, if that makes sense.
No, I really appreciate that. I mean, context is everything, right? So, depending on the country you're in, you're going to have to build a different strategy and and not necessarily be like, it's got to be this way, right? You're going to have to think very carefully about what's going to work the best in each of these markets, what's going to resonate the most with families. You have this idea about like, you have this oil drilling analogy we talked about where you
Yeah.
think international recruitment is heading. Um, Break that down for me.
Yeah. So what I was running into a lot of times was this mentality from, heads of school or other people to just say, well, all you have to do is get on a plane, go to the country and pick up 5 or 6 kids and come on back. And I was trying to figure out how do I talk about this and how the times have changed. And so I use this analogy of oil drilling. Back in the day, 100, 120 years, 150 years ago, whatever it is, you could, whether you're at, I think it was Dome Pot in Pennsylvania, or, you go to Texas or even Southern California, you drill a well and all of a sudden the oil spurts out and you don't have to do a whole lot. And a lot of times we're still in that mentality of all you have to do is drill a well and you're going to have this massive pipeline. And we see evidence of that. As I said earlier in this conversation, you had Japan for a decade, you had Korea for 10 to 15 years. China was a massive producer, and it supported a lot of international education across the world. And it still is, that's the biggest contributor to international education, even though it's a shrinking market. What we're running into though is there is not anything, I don't see another market that's going to replace China, and I don't see China ever going back to what it was, for a multitude of reasons. Socioeconomic, there's demographic, but there's also just the change in kind of the what families are looking for and what they're expecting. And I don't think we're going to see a desire to go back to the numbers that we had. So if you're thinking, maybe India is going to come online, I maybe for certain schools or for certain pockets, but not in the same level, and certainly not to the same degree for the US or other parts of the world. Africa as a whole, maybe, but that's very much a, kind of pockets. And I don't think the numbers are there until the economy in on that continent really changes to sustain a lot larger numbers. So what we're looking at now is a very different playing field. We're going away from this drill a hole and all of a sudden you've got a lot of things there, to now, if you're looking at the oil industry, there's not a lot of those out there. What you're seeing instead is like fracking or shale, in the shale, or it's that deep oil reservoirs that are under the ocean, and you have to spend a lot of money to get money. And that's what we have to do now. Is it can't just be one plane ticket and you're going to pick up $500,000 worth of enrollments. Now you're going to have to spend a lot of money to get, you still can produce a profit, but your profit margins are significantly different because of the investment to actually get to where the oil is, whether it's through fracking or deep well drilling or anything like that. So I think helping boards or heads of school change their mentality from this, gusher mentality to deep well drilling is going to help them understand, okay, then I have to rethink the profit margins. So I either need to make sure, if I want to get a certain amount of revenue out of it, I need to put in a certain amount of revenue. I have to invest. I have to put in the resources to make sure that we're going to get what we need out of it. Or I have to rethink what my expectations are. I can't expect to get a clear profit margin of this amount of money, but if I only spend that much or invest that much into it. And so that, to me, I'm hoping that will help people understand that it's a very different business model from the just do a quick dig a hole to now there's a massive amount of work that goes into pulling students out of the market.
That's a brilliant way to look at it. I mean, and what it suggests to me is a couple of things. One, you've got to like really commit to the hustle. Like there's just going to be a lot of air miles flown, a lot of meetings had, and it's harder, but it's still worth the investment, especially if you allocate the right resources to it. It strikes me also that, the role of agents has really changed significantly over the years. I mean, I remember 20 years ago, very few schools would even entertain the idea. Now it feels like a common, it's a common way to recruit kids. Talk about how that market has shifted and what boards and heads and business offices should understand.
Yeah. And I think there's been a lot of seismic shifts, at least in my experience. When I first started in the early 2000s, I was working for a boarding school out west, and I remember hearing all these New England boarding schools saying we'll never work with agents because we will never pay commission and it's unethical. And I certainly understand that there are ethical implications, but I also understand that just like a lot of universities and others, that you can build practices and best practices that allow you to be able to work in an ethical manner. What I found interesting is that they were trying to dictate the terms of all the schools because there are some schools that would not survive if they weren't working with agents. And
Yeah.
nowadays, what we're seeing is that there's so many changes in the marketplace that a lot of schools, even those that 20 years ago were saying never would we do this, they're now saying, hey, can you give me a sample agent agreement, because we really need to start talking about this. And we want to go slow, we want to dip our toe into it, and we're not going to do it for everyone, but at least they're beginning to recognize that the world has changed. So for me, when I'm thinking about working with agents, what you need to do is first understand what are the best practices, or what's ethical for you. And there are a lot of different ways that you can go about working with an agent. And part of it is, how can you build a partnership? Because there are some times where if you're working with an agent, they're going to be they're basically going to be the one that's going to be able to open the door, because there are some countries where the idea of working with an agent is so fixed into the culture that you will struggle to get anyone out of that country. Whereas if you work with an agent, you now have a resource and a pathway to start being exposed to families, because families would be very uncomfortable working with a school directly. That's to them, that they wouldn't want to do that, and they feel comfortable working through an agent. So for you to be able to diversify your international population, for you to be able to, in my mind, this is the argument I always make when I'm talking to heads of school who are asking me about, should we just do a quick trip to this country, and would we be able to get what we're looking for? And my argument is always, well, you fly to a city, you're there for what, 24 hours, 48 hours, 72 hours. Even if you're there for a week, there are 51 other weeks when you're not there. So what momentum have you built up to even get it so that you're doing something while you're there? But then once you leave, what's happening? You can do follow-up, but you're only following up people that you actually had contact with. What about all the other people who 2 weeks later say, oh, we should really start looking at studying abroad? They've missed you, and you're no longer there, and you don't have a presence. And so all of that momentum just starts to bleed away. So I've always believed that what you need to do is build a system so that you have momentum year round. Part of that is working with agents, because they're in the place. And that helps counteract the competition you have, because there are local schools that are looking for those families who are thinking maybe we need to consider an alternate educational opportunity. There's also other boarding schools that are coming into that city a week after you, or 2 weeks after you, or a month after you, that are picking up those families who you might have been able to get to had you still had a presence in that city. And the only way you can have a presence is through agents, your alumni, other networks, past parents. Maybe you've built a strong relationship with some of the school counselors and some of the schools that are nearby. But there's only a certain number of ways that you can maintain a presence, or keep your brand there, or awareness, whatever you want to call it, so that when families are starting to talk about their options, your school comes up as part of that conversation. And for me, when I'm looking at that, I want to do everything I can using every avenue that I have, or every tool available to me. And agents are one of those tools. Now, how I work with them and the relationship I build might be different than what another school does. And that's okay, as long as
Yeah.
we're all on board, and when we're trying to do things above board, it's all good as far as I'm concerned.
Does that mean you have to be super intentional about the markets that you choose to compete in? I mean, there's just so many markets around the globe. Like you can't be everywhere all the time. So,
Yeah. And
does
I've
that
tried.
it, you try, but you can't, right? But even if, and I guess to clarify, it's if you're just building systems across every market would be a massive, massive undertaking. So, do you intentionally say, "Hey, these are the X number of markets that we're going to prioritize each year," or do you just kind of build a stable and then regularly adding to it?
So the way I go through deciding how to build my travel plans, I look at it as a kind of like a three-legged stool. And so the first stool or the first leg to the stool is going to be your major pipelines. What are the areas that are producing regularly for you?
Yeah.
Because you don't want to take them for granted. You want to make sure that you're maintaining your relationships with them, and you don't want to be caught with another world event that is all of a sudden going to pull the rug out from underneath you, and all of a sudden that market is shut down, or at least it's starting to to take a downturn, and you've lost your context, or at least you've lost momentum there. So what I always do is we look at what are the producers and who are the ones that we need, because if you could spend your entire budget on that, and then you're not really opening up any new markets. So
Yeah.
who are the major producers, and who are the ones that we need to look at right now and in this year, and to maintain contacts, reestablish some, but also build new ones. Then the second leg of the stool are going to be, who are the marginal markets? What are the markets where you're getting a handful of students, maybe onesies and twosies, but you think that there's potential to build them up to a larger population or a larger pipeline. And then once again, you're going to have a much larger list. What Before I talk about how I kind of pick and choose, I'll go to the third leg of the stool, and that's your new markets. And this is my personal philosophy, and this is what I've been doing for the past 25 years, is I believe that part of what I should be doing for the school to improve their educational experience, because I believe that there's an educational value in diversity,
Yeah.
is to then diversify the population. When I started at one of the schools I worked at, we had a good percentage of international students on the campus, but they were coming from basically 10 countries. And that was it. And then you had the onesies or twosies that were coming just randomly out of the blue, not through any effort of our own, but they just kind of came because they heard about our school. And so by the time I finished, we had about 25 different countries at the school, and we were working on getting closer to 30. Now I'm at a school where we have over 70 nationalities. And for us to see the value of having students from all over the world talking with each other. So you have not only this racial, cultural, historical, you have a socioeconomic difference, you have and also we're not a highly selective school, we're a non-selective school. And so you also have that academic difference, students who are going to struggle and work hard and get their B's and C's, and that's great. And you also have the high flyers that could go anywhere at any university at any time in the world. And having that diversity, in my mind, always enhances the experience for everyone. And so my belief has always been to increase the number of countries represented, because at least that's one tangible way that you can show that you're diversifying the population. But I don't want to keep it superficial at that level, because there's other ways you can diversify populations beyond just the number of countries represented, but it's one way. So if you start to look at how, what's my diversification plan, there's a lot of ways you can implement that. And one of them is through your international recruitment. So what I do is I look at new markets as that third leg of the stool. And so what I do when we're building out our list, we're going to have a list that we could never do, even if I had 10 people in my office and they were all traveling year round and we had an unlimited budget. We couldn't do it all. So what we then say is, okay, who are the major pipelines that we want to go to this year? Then what we do is we use those as anchors, and we use them as a way to say, okay, what's nearby that is kind of that growth market, and what are the new markets, and how can we then build around that? And sometimes what we do is we then work our way backwards. So we'll say, we're hearing that this is starting to open up. We'd like to go there, but what's nearby that we can use that's a growth market or a major pipeline, so it at least justifies the trip? Because you never want to go to a head of school who says, hey, we just invested this money to that location. Did we get any students out of it? One, that's a bad mistake, because what you can say is, well, that trip produced this because I didn't just go to that one location. That was part of an overall trip strategy. But two, you also need to change the ROI conversation to say one trip to the one location is not going to do it. That's that whole gusher mentality.
Yeah.
Where we need
Yeah.
to go back to, how are we investing, and how many years, and what do we need to do? What is the checklist that we're going to use to actually say that it's actually producing for us, and how long does it take?
It's a great segue into my last question, which is, and I know you've had these conversations with heads at different schools who've called you, but if they're finding that our international recruitment just isn't what it was, right? We're just not in
Yeah.
the same space that we were a few years, 4, 5, 6, 7 years back. And they're thinking, what do we do? What's the first question that you ask them? I'm so curious. I've never asked you this before.
Yeah. And I'm always worried that I'm annoying them because when I get on the phone call, I literally had this conversation a few months ago with a head of school. He called and said, I'd like to get your advice. And the first 45 minutes, I was asking him questions about his program and his school, because if you're going out and you're going to market your school, you need to look at what you offer and does it coincide with what people are looking for. And if you don't know what you're offering as far as what they're looking for, then you're going to go there and waste a lot of money. And
Yeah.
so what I had to do is I had to sit down and start asking them questions. What about your EAL program? Are you actually able to handle students who are going to come in and they might have a different profile than what you're used to? What about the cultural onboarding that you're going to be able to have for these students who are going to be coming from a different location? They might have different needs or different desires. They might need, different churches, different hairdressers, different food. All of these things you need to start to look at to say, okay, if you can even bring in an international student, are you going to be successful, or are they going to be unhappy and lonely and leave and basically have poor word of mouth? So part of what you need to do if you're thinking about doing something like international recruitment is you need to first make sure that you have the product that they're looking for and put yourself in a position that it is desirable for them. So part of that is a little bit of analysis, a little bit of self-reflection, maybe having conversations with other people who have experience. It doesn't have to be me, but it could be, there's a lot of people with a lot of international recruitment experience who can kind of give you an idea of what you should be looking for. So that way, when you do start looking at where do I go, what country should I visit, and how should I do it, you're at least in a better position because you know the story that you're going to tell, you know what's going to resonate with them, and you know once they come that they're going to have a positive experience. And that's the thing I find a lot of times is schools are coming in and they're giving the same story that they'd be giving to a domestic family on an open day, and that story it just falls like a lead balloon. And you have to really think about, who is my audience, what are they looking for, what do they need, and can I provide that for them?
Josh Clark, Director of Enrollment and Marketing at TASIS England. This has been a true masterclass in recruitment of international students. So thank you for that. If somebody wants to reach out, what's the best way for them to do that?
Yeah, I guess just my email, jclark@tasisengland.org. So that's JCLARK at TASIS and happy to help in any way, because I believe that the more we all are supportive of each other, the better we can make, the stronger the market.
Yeah, great words to end on. Josh, thanks again. And if you're part of Moonshot Lab, hang tight. We are about to head into the extended version of the interview. But again, Josh, thank you.
Thank you.